Hi, I'm Chad, and this is Ryan from Electrona. We are Jamf services partners and training partners, and we support a number of organizations as a Jamf MSP. Just as a quick note, throughout the presentation, feel free to send questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer. As I mentioned, as we are an MSP, we help a lot of organizations solve tough problems using automation, and we're happy to share some of these workflows with you today. All right, so one of these problems that we encounter within our organization, and a common need for many organizations that we support, is not only the need to set up new employees with new devices, which tends to be the thing that we're always focused on, automated device enrollment and zero-touch enrollment, trying to figure out how do we get that great first-day experience for the user that has their new Mac for their new job. But we also have existing users who sometimes need to get a new computer from time to time, what we often refer to as that device lifecycle process. People don't, like change. They really like to have their computer set up the way that they have it. They like to customize it, set their settings, configure their dock the way that they like, maybe fill their desktop with a whole bunch of items. We want to make sure that, when our end user moves to a new device, that it's not kind of a frightening or frustrating process, as oftentimes that can lead the user to be resistant in actually, getting moved over, to a new computer. So, as this tends to be a fairly big challenge for us, trying to address the needs of the organization to keep things secure, reliable, make sure everything stays properly managed, make sure the computer stays enrolled in Jamf Pro. We've tried to come up with a way to solve that and do it in a way that, accomplishes the organization's need, but also the end user's need to have continuity with their existing device. Currently, there are some existing tools that we can leverage, some that you probably are very familiar with. Migration Assistant, like I have the screenshot here on the screen at the moment. Really great for end users, especially those that are, at home. You've got a home user, you want to just, get from your old Mac to your new Mac, you plug them in, hook it up, run through Migration Assistant. You can get, all your files, settings, data, everything from the old Mac moved over to the new one. For those of us that work in the enterprise, I think we recognize that there are some problems, with these existing tools. We may only want the user, to complete, certain steps. We may not want to bring over all configurations. We might not want to bring over all apps. Some apps might not work if we copy them over that way. So, this tool may not be right for us. We also have the option of restoring from backup. We've got a number of different backup tools that are often in use in the corporate environment, whether those be, physical backups or online backups. But these also present some challenges, because if we restore from an online backup, it may only include certain files or folders, may not provide all those settings that our user wants. And sometimes backups aren't entirely complete. Where the user has their old Mac, it's sitting right there. So, sometimes we've even looked at, we just manually copy your data over, drag it over with AirDrop, connect it with a Thunderbolt cable, whatever it might be. But, that can be very time consuming, both for the IT representative that needs to work with the end user, that person on the help desk. And sometimes, we copy the files over, we move them into a different place than they were before, and we're maybe not getting all those settings and all that configuration. The exact experience that the user has on their old computer may not be the same as the new one. And then we run into problems where, we've got the user set up with their new Mac. They've got it all migrated, but they're still using their old one because they don't want to move over and they feel like they don't quite have everything. And then they continue to use the old Mac, so the new one becomes further and further out of date. And the organization's need to get everybody set up with a new computer can be delayed. Another couple things that, have run us into some trouble, especially with Migration Assistant. Migration Assistant is awesome. It provides a really great way to, get everything over from your old Mac to your new one. But in a lot of cases in a corporate environment, we may not want to actually have the user do that. In our case, we were trying to do this with Migration Assistant. We tried to nudge our users, we want you to only click the checkbox next to your user account. Don't migrate over those other user accounts. Don't bring over your applications, because we're deploying those already with automated device enrollment. We don't want you to bring over settings, because we don't want like a previous MDM enrollment on your old Mac being brought over to the new one. But there isn't a way for us to control these settings. There's not a way that we can push out a configuration profile. There's not a way that we can guide the user through this process, because once they've gotten into Migration Assistant, they're kind of on their own. So it doesn't really provide, the experience that we want. So we had to develop something on our own. We want to make sure that it only has user information, and we want to make sure that we don't bring over settings and apps that are not appropriate to be brought over to the new Mac. And we also want to make sure that we preserved user level MDM. One of the other hiccups that we can run into with Migration Assistant, of course, is that when the user sets up their new Mac, they get it from IT. They go through that initial setup assistant on the new Mac, and they create that user account. That first user account is the one that is managed for user level MDM, and we don't want to end up with a situation where user level MDM is associated with the wrong user account on the Mac, and if we remove it, we won't be able to control those settings for our end user. So we also wanted to make sure, as part of this process, that whatever workflow we developed, we would be able to preserve the user level MDM of that initial user that was created during the setup assistant. So in order to do that, we needed to make sure that we didn't create a new user account, and we wanted to make sure that we replaced the data in the existing home folder. So we wanted to change this process. We wanted to come up with a better way to do this. So we set out to design a solution that would allow our end user to perform the migration to their new Mac on their own with as little assistance from IT as possible, and provide them with the look and feel of their old Mac, things like their desktop, their documents, their settings, how they have things configured in system preferences or their various app settings. And be able to, also make it available to them to be able to use in self-service. We can ship them a cable along with their new Mac so that they can do that. And then when they're finished, they just simply pop their, old computer in the box, slap a label on it, ship it back to the corporate office, because a lot of our users are not, working from an office right now. And we want to make sure that we can do this with Jamf Pro. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Ryan to tell us a little bit about how it works.
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Ryan with Electrona, and we're going to take a look at how our migration tool works. First, we're going to talk about kind of the technical aspects of it, and then we'll get an idea of what it looks like to the end user. So let's talk about the prereqs that we install first. So first, we get the company logo. So we want this to kind of be a branded experience for the organization. We're also going to leverage DEP Notify during this process to give a good look and feel to the workflow and provide some progress of the workflow. We're going to install Rsync 3.1.3, and I'll explain why in a moment. And additionally, we're going to install DocUtil, and I'll explain why we'll use DocUtil in a moment as well. So the first thing that we need to do is we kind of need to gather those data points that we need for the entire process. So initially what we do is we display a Jamf helper dialog with instructions. And we're going to do this in order to allow the user to connect their device, their old device and their new device via Thunderbolt cable, and kind of guide them on how to place their old device into target disk mode so we can attach to that old device. We're going to detect external Thunderbolt disks as they're connected, or optionally let the user pick from one that might already be connected. We locate the old user account on the remote Mac. We will verify the user's local password. And then we also verify the user's remote account password with their keychain. So let's talk about the Thunderbolt disk detection initially. So the way we do this is we compare changes in the mounted volumes every 5 seconds. And any additional volumes detected, which are Thunderbolt, are added to an array. And then if we've detected more than one Thunderbolt volume within those 5 seconds, we'll prompt the user to allow them to select the particular Thunderbolt volume that their user account resides on. And then again, like I mentioned before, optionally, the user can choose their own Thunderbolt volume if they've previously connected it prior to kicking off this workflow. Then the next thing we need to do is locate the old user account on the remote machine. So once we know the Thunderbolt volume, we can then get all the old user accounts. And the way we would do this is a kind of a simple find command. And then we just are looking at the user home folders on the remote machine and listing those and kind of cleaning up some of those particular home folders so that we have a listing of the home folders on the remote Mac. Next, we're going to verify the user's local password. And we use DSCL to validate the user's local password. And the reason that we do this is because what we want to do is we eventually want to get to a state where the user's local password and their keychain that comes over from the remote machine match. So in order to do that, again, one of the pieces that we need is the local password. And the next thing we need to do is verify that the user's old password. And again, we do that by unlocking their old keychain. So the first thing we do here, if you see the code, is we actually attempt to, again, initially we're verifying that local account password. We try that password first to see if it unlocks a remote keychain, because then we can kind of bypass prompting the user. And then if for some reason that the existing password doesn't match, we can then prompt, and we basically use the security command unlock-keychain until we get a valid password that unlocks that remote keychain. And then obviously we want to make sure that the storage requirements kind of are in our favor. So we need to ensure that the user's new Mac can accommodate the amount of storage required for their old account data. So we don't want to run through this process and begin migrating data and then end up running out of disk space on the new Mac because their new Mac has a smaller hard disk than their old. So we need to validate the storage requirements first. And this is done after we actually launch DEP Notify, so we can kind of display a bit of progress because this might take a little bit of time. And we want to try to eliminate time during the workflow where the user doesn't see anything on the screen. So they kind of think that something's not working and they maybe just shut down or something drastic like that. And as you can see in the screenshot, basically we're using a combination of DF, the DF binary, and the DU binary, and doing a little bit of arithmetic on that to ensure that the new Mac can accommodate all of the data in the user's home folder. And if not, we can display a dialog to the end user, alerting them to potentially contact IT for assistance. And then we can end the process so that we don't move forward and get to a point in the process where we're just bound to fail because we don't have enough storage. And then the next step is to perform the Rsync with progress. So the reason why we leverage Rsync 3.1.3 is because we can get the total progress of the transfer using these flags. So we use --info equals progress2, no inc recursive so that we don't delve too far into the transfer. And then also we use outbuff equals L so that we actually can capture that progress and then write it to a file, which can then be read on a periodic basis and then written into the process to kind of populate the progress bar in DEP Notify. So as you can see, basically what we're doing is we're performing the Rsync at the top of this screenshot here with particular Rsync commands. We're supplying the source and the destination, and then we're basically taking the output of that, and we are basically parsing that and then throwing it into a log as well. And we have that command running in the background, and we're capturing the PID of that command. And while that command is actually executing, you can see we're doing kind of a while ps-p and then that rsync PID process. So essentially what we're doing is while the rsync is happening, we're going to then capture that progress that's being written to a file And then as that progress moves up, we're going to then change the window, the DEP notify window, so that the user can see the progress from 0 all the way to 100. So now data is being transferred to a temporary location on the new Mac. So we're not putting it, this user is logged in at the time, they're running this process through self-service. And so obviously they're logged in, and we're not, trying to overwrite the data while they're actually logged in. So we put it into a temporary location on the Mac, so it's safe. And then, as we move on, we're going to then transfer that data to its new home, which is actually the user's home. And again, I mentioned syncing those their login password with their old keychain password, and we can do that two different ways. One would be either changing their actual password for the local account if we specify which one of these methods we're going to use with the parameter in the Jamf Pro policy. So again, either we'll use sysadmin CTL, update the password for the local account to match the old keychain, or we'll use the security binary to change the old keychain password to match the existing home folder or the existing user's password, so that when that user gets logged in, they don't have any issues with their keychain, which you often might see if you're kind of manually transferring data, especially if you're including the user's library folder. And the next thing we do is, so at this point, we already kind of have all the data on the new machine, and we need to kind of get that data into the existing home folder in a state where it's safe to do that. And we're going to do that at the login window. So what we do is we create a login window launch agent, so that when the user gets logged out, which will force them to be logged out, they can't actually log in while this launch agent is running, displaying Jamf Helper over the login window. So it keeps them from logging in, and we can finish putting their data in place. And then you can see here, essentially, we're just using kind of a combination of plist buddy and plutil to create that login window launch agent. And again, this occurs kind of in the background as the workflow is running. And then we just queue it up so that when we log the user out, this Jamf Helper dialog is displayed over the login window and blocking them from logging in and giving us a few moments to move that data in place. And kind of some of the things that we do to just button up the migration. Obviously, we want to make sure we fix permissions on the newly transferred data so that the new owner or the new user owns that particular data. We're going to force login, like I mentioned, and we're going to force logout and block the login. We put the existing local account data for that new user in a backup location. So in case they might have used the machine for a few days and put something on their desktop, we could potentially get that data because it's still going to reside locally on the new machine. And then while they're at the login window, the old account data is moved from a temp location in place of the user's home folder. And all this really happens just within a few moments. I know it looks like a lot of steps, but we're talking about seconds here. And then, of course, we're going to kill that Jamf Helper dialog and allow the user to log in. So let's take a look at it from the user's perspective. And again, this is initiated from self-service. So they just open up self-service. They click the migrate button on the policy so that they can kick off the workflow. And then they see this dialog that gives them some instructions on how to place their old Mac into target disk mode. They're going to turn off their old Mac. Either they can connect the old Mac and new Mac together using a Thunderbolt cable, power the old Mac on while holding the T button. This is kind of the way target disk mode has worked for quite a while. And as this process is happening, they're kind of connecting the device. We will then detect a Thunderbolt volume in the background. Or again, optionally, they can choose the choose button here if they've already connected to their device prior to starting this workflow. And they would see a dialog like this, where they can then choose from a list of Thunderbolt connected volumes. They could then choose Macintosh HD1 in this case. And again, in the background, we're looking at that remote Mac and capturing a list of home folders, and then allowing the user to actually pick from a list of those remote users on that old device. And then again, we need to make sure those passwords are in sync. So we capture the password at the top for the new user on the new Mac, and then at the bottom for the old user on the old Mac. And again, the top dialog, we're using DSCL to do the authentication validation. And then in the bottom, we're using the security binary to validate the password against the old keychain. And then after this process, again, when we're calculating the storage requirements, we're displaying a DP notify window so that the user kind of knows that something is happening in the background. Actually capturing the free space on a local Mac is pretty instantaneous, but on a remote device that's attached via Thunderbolt, it might take some time depending on how much storage it is. So that's why we want to make sure that something is being displayed while this process is occurring. And then once we've gathered, once we've verified that the storage requirements on the new Mac are sufficient, we then start the rsync process. And as you can see, the user is going to be seeing this progress from 0 to 100. And in this case, this is not much data, but because we're going to be going pretty quickly. But typically, the speeds are very fast using Thunderbolt. So this is much better process than attempting to do something via like SMB or something like that. This is directly attached. So this is going to be pretty quick for the end user. As you can see, we're pretty much finished here. And then the user sees a dialog like this, which basically lets them know that they're going to be logged out. And based on which method we chose to sync the password, either if we're going to reset the old keychain password or change the new password, this dialog will be updated. And as you can see here, it's indicating that they're going to be logging back in using their old password. When they click finish, they're then forced logged out. And as you can see, we have Jamf helper at the login window. And again, this is, it's a nice looking for the end user. Again, this is only displayed for a few moments while the data that's already existing on the device is moved into place. And then the user, this dialog will go away. They'll be able to then log in again, in this case, with their old password. And then things will look pretty familiar to them. Typically, when I've walked through this process with end users, things look pretty messy on the desktop, but surprisingly, the end user is very pleased with this result. So, yeah, that's definitely we kind of walk through the technical aspect as well as what the end user sees from their end. These are just kind of one example of some of the workflows that we build to make life easier for our end users. If you wanted to get some more information on this or some of the other things that we could do, you can look at electrona.com/migrator. You can look at our GitHub, github.com/electrona, or let's talk at electrona.com.
Thanks so much for joining us. We'll take a look at those questions there in the chat, and really appreciate you coming to check out some information about our Enterprise Migration Assistant tool. Thanks.